Well, welcome everyone. This looks like an intimate audience, so be prepared for audience participation because I can get you each to ask a question individually. Thank you very much for showing up to this discussion today on ASEAN, and I'm very honoured to have with me many representatives of ASEAN as a region. I'm looking at that. So let's start with some audience participation. Who knows what countries are in ASEAN? Shout them out. Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Myanmar.
There's one more.
Cambodia.
Starts with a C.
Cambodia. We're close. We're almost there. One that's heavily represented here today. Singapore! Yeah, Singapore.
Oh yeah, Singapore.
Here we go. I'll give you a hint. So it's been really interesting to hear a lot of people discussing global north versus global south. Where would you think ASEAN sits? Global north or global south in these discussions? Global north. Only a little bit of Indonesia crosses over into the global south. So I'm not quite sure where we're going when we have these discussions. So I'm Darian McBain. I live in Singapore. I have lived in Thailand. I've also lived in the UK. I am a senior associate with the University of Oxford. I'm also a visiting professor with the London School of Economics, and I run my own business called Outsourced Chief Sustainability Officer. So I've worked as a CSO in the corporate world for most of my career, and more recently with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which was my entree into the world of finance in ASEAN. And I have a very esteemed panel here with me today. You can read all of their bios online. Starting from the far end, we have Madalena Mohammed, the Director of Sustainability Unit for Bank Negara Malaysia. So that's Malaysia's central bank. Then we have Eric Lim, the Chief Sustainability Officer for UOB, based in Singapore. We have Swissa Pongpek, Head of Sustainability Research at PEER at the Bank of Thailand. And then we have Jen Hui Tan, Global Head of Stewardship and Sustainable Investing for Fidelity International. Now, just so you can get a flavour of the variety you have of different languages and cultures across ASEAN, I'm going to ask them all to say hello to you in their native language or how they would greet each other from ASEAN. Madalena?
Oh, okay. Starting with me. Salam sejahtera dan selamat petang. What it means is that greetings and good afternoon.
Thank you.
I'll do two in Singapore. Hello, right? Ni hao, which is English and Mandarin.
Thank you.
So in Thai we would say Sawadee ka.
Sawadee ka.
So I'm Malaysian, but I'm here representing the ASEAN region. And unfortunately, despite the advancements in taxonomies and economic cooperation, they haven't yet settled on a common language. So I can't say hello to you other than hello.
Hello works. And I'm Australian, so not actually part of ASEAN unless you expand it to ASEAN +6, but I'll say g'day. Thank you very much for showing up. So I'm going to start with a few interesting factoids about ASEAN for those who don't know much about it. First of all, what do you think? The population of ASEAN, greater or smaller than the European Union? Hands up for greater. Yeah. Who thinks smaller? Yeah, it's a risky one, isn't it? Okay, ASEAN has approximately 686 million people, the European Union 448 million people, the US 340 million people. So approximately 8.6% of the global population live in ASEAN. So it's a pretty important region, actually, if you're looking from the size. And it's got a very young population in most of the countries. It's one of the most culturally diverse regions in the world. So Indonesia alone has over 300 native languages. So if you're here for the previous session on biodiversity and we're talking about indigenous cultures, a lot of different cultures across the ASEAN region. Very high digital literacy. I don't know what people are doing with these, but there's approximately 147 mobile phones per 100 people. So everyone's got at least a few phones. And it's a big area. It covers around 4.5 million square kilometres. Because I used to work in the oceans, 130,000 square kilometres of coastline. So oceans are important, land, agriculture, manufacturing. So there's a lot going on in ASEAN. And I thought, just to get the conversation started, I'll ask each of the speakers to tell me something about the country that you work in, and Jen, you've just said you work across ASEAN, that the audience may not know. So maybe I'll go with Swissa, if I can start with you.
Okay, thank you. So, other than our beautiful beaches and our wonderful, warm, sunny climate, I'm sure that, you may not know that Thailand also plays a very important role in the global supply chain for both manufactured goods and also agricultural goods. So we are one of the largest exporters of electronics, as well as the world's second largest exporter of rice and sugar. And we are also the largest exporter of foods, such as canned tuna. And so the effects of climate change in Thailand can have some global implications, not only in Thailand, but also globally, and affect food security. So the physical effects of climate change will have huge economic impacts in Thailand. We have very long coastlines in Thailand, and we have lots of drought and heat waves. And so this, can also impact tourism, which is a very big industry in Thailand as well. And we saw the effects of floodings when in 2011 we had very big floods in Thailand. And this resulted in losses of around 13% of GDP in Thailand, or around 46 billion US dollars. And this affected the shortage of hard disk drives globally. So, even though we're a very small country, what happens in Thailand from climate change can have effects elsewhere as well.
You say Thailand is a small country. Do you know the population of the UK is around 67.3 million people? The population of Thailand is 71.6. So actually, it depends if you think the UK is a small country or not. Thailand is bigger. Thank you. I used to work for the world's largest seafood processor, headquartered in Thailand, and it owns companies like John West, if you live in the UK, or Chicken of the Sea in the US. You don't realize how big some of these companies throughout ASEAN are. Eric, what's something we don't know about Singapore?
I nearly choked when Swissa said Thailand was small. I'm from Singapore. For those of you who haven't been to Singapore, I'll share a couple of interesting facts. Number one, as you know, it's an island state. And by island, I really do mean island. East to west were 42 kilometers. North to south were 26 kilometers. We've managed to fit 5.5 million people on that tiny piece of rock and somehow call it a country. So, small. A second interesting fact about Singapore, and I promise I'll stitch this up to why I mentioned this, is in parliamentary democracies, Singapore has the longest running uninterrupted political party. All right, for those of you familiar, it's called the PAP, and we're healthily into what we call the next fourth generation of PAP leaders. The last thing I want to share quickly about Singapore is since our founding, call it 58, 59 years ago, every Singaporean deep down knows we have no right to exist as a country. So this concept of existential threat and existential existence, right, is something that's very deeply built into the psyche of every Singaporean. The reason I bring these three points up is to say, when we talk about something like sustainability, Singapore is a country that has some of the elements that allows it to understand it from a physical transition risk perspective, because we've always been under threat. It's a country that's very small, and so physical, conceptual distances are very easy to bridge. You don't have decisions that cross thousands of miles and multi-layers. Everybody kind of knows everybody, so it's very easy to align and make decisions. And it's got a long, stable government that's been able to make plans for the last 58 years and is currently making plans for the next 58 years. And so, with a lot of the disadvantages Singapore has, importing just about everything we need, there are a couple of advantages we're trying to make as useful as possible in our journey on sustainability. Thanks.
That's very true. The concept of 6 degrees of separation isn't needed in Singapore. Two does it. I realize you don't diss anyone in Singapore because they will find out. Madalena, tell us something about Malaysia that we might not know.
Right. Can I just have a show of hands? How many of you have actually heard of the Amazon rainforest? Right. Daintree rainforest? Okay, less people. How about Taman Negara? Oh, I'm surprised. Quite a number. Okay. All right. And what about Borneo lowland rainforest? Right. Okay. So Malaysia is actually the home not to one, but 2 of the oldest rainforests in the world. So so one is the one which we share together with Brunei and Indonesia, that is the Borneo lowland rainforest, and the other is Taman Negara, or we call it National Park. So both these rainforests are estimated to be at least 130 million years old, compared to the Amazon, which is only 55 million years old. So, and given, the length it has actually been in existence, it is actually very rich in biodiversity. It is very rich in terms of flora and fauna. In fact, I think the largest flower in the world, that is Rafflesia, is actually situated in the Taman Negara.
Thank you. And I actually went in search of that flower recently, unsuccessfully,
okay.
but I did go looking for it.
It only blooms for a few days, and that's it, once a year.
Indeed. Okay, Jen, you span across the region. What's your interesting piece of information?
Well, I work in London, so I don't presume to tell this audience any interesting factoids about England, and I only moved here last August.
We don't want the England facts.
No.
ASEAN.
Well, I am Malaysian, and so I want to second everything that Melina says, although I cede to her the right to represent our country, because she's infinitely better qualified. But I will say we have some great food, some of the friendliest people, and also some great beaches for anyone who wants to visit.
Very good. Thank you very much. Now, why are we talking about ASEAN today? So I was speaking with Ben Caldecott, who obviously, unfortunately, isn't here, last year. He's a regular visitor to Singapore and the region. There's a lot going on there. So I said I used to work for the Monetary Authority of Singapore. There's a lot of movement around green and sustainable finance. There's a very dynamic space around fintech, ESG and green fintech. There's a lot of work looking at regulations, but I think often these discussions aren't brought to the UK and Europe. And so you start to get this conversation about the global north versus the global south. Actually, that divide isn't as great as you may think. I think everybody's on the spectrum, everybody is working on this continuum of good practice, getting better, and what we want to share today is some of the things that are happening in the region that I think can have an impact on the work that's happening here in the UK and in Europe. So maybe, Jen, if I turn to you first, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face either in each country or, for your case, across ASEAN with respect to climate change and sustainability?
So I think there's sort of three main issues I'd highlight. I think the first is, hopefully you'll have picked up, ASEAN is an incredibly diverse region with a lot of different countries at different stages of economic development, very radically different economies. Some are very heavily services based, some are still agricultural based. And I'm also sorry to say some of the widest social inequalities in the world as well, with people at all levels of the income scale. And so that creates a challenge when it comes to coordinating climate change and sustainability. The second, I think, is that industrialization of ASEAN over the last 20, 30 years has brought some terrific benefits to everyone living there, but it has also, I think, brought with it some significant environmental challenges, whether it's around air pollution or whether it's around waste management or water sanitation or over-extraction of natural resources. I think the list of environmental issues in ASEAN continues to grow. And ASEAN is increasingly becoming both a contributor to and a victim of climate change and sustainability issues in general. That, I think, calls for a broader change in how ASEAN will develop over the next, say, 20, 30 years, a more substantial transition of its mode of economic development, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But it will require a rethinking of supply chains, of how we are able to distribute the fruits of growth more fairly. And I think the third is around the vulnerability of ASEAN to climate change. 4 of the 10 most vulnerable nations to climate change, both physical and transition risk, sit in the ASEAN region. And I think it is, as for all the reasons that Eric said, that different parts of ASEAN are uniquely at risk when it comes to both of these impacts.
Thank you. Swissa?
Yes. So, as you mentioned just now that, for the countries in ASEAN are vulnerable to climate change. So Thailand is one of those countries. So we are third in ASEAN, which is vulnerable to climate change. And not only are we vulnerable, we are also not able to handle natural disasters very well. We rank 39 out of 48 countries globally in being able to manage climate change. And as I mentioned earlier just now, that our economy is also very reliant on agriculture and manufacturing, which will be harmed by the change in climate change. And and if this continues on, the World Bank estimates that in roughly, if we have another flood like that we had in 2011, this will also affect our GDP by around 10%. And this will have fiscal constraints as well, because this will have to be borne by the government, who will have to maybe compensate farmers, and then we will have issues as well with the private sector who would also incur losses. And so this also has fiscal sustainability implications. And in terms of social implications, we also, our population centers are nearby to coastal areas, and so they're also vulnerable to the rising sea levels. And it could also exacerbate existing stresses we have in the economy, such as the high debt level of farmers. So we have around 5 million agricultural households in Thailand, and they're highly indebted. So if they face further drought and flooding, this could also exacerbate the risk. Another challenge for us, though, I think, is concerning the transition risk. So not only physical, is that we have a lot of SMEs in Thailand. We have SMEs account for around 99% of all enterprises in Thailand, and they generate around 14 million jobs and around 86% of total employment. And most of these SMEs are in the micro SMEs and the S size, so only around 2% are medium size. So this is a big challenge for us, and how do we be able to transition and bring along the SMEs as well, who are very critical to our economy. The larger firms we are not so worried about. Most of them have had implemented changes, and even though they are the biggest emitters, so it's the SMEs that are really a concern for Thailand.
Thank you. Eric, for Singapore.
Yeah, I'll actually shift out of Singapore a little bit, because Singapore is, of course, Singapore banks Singapore, but Singapore is also a banking center really as a gateway into the region. So I'll talk a bit more about ASEAN's challenges. The big conversation that we've got to crack for ASEAN is this concept of a just transition. And when we talk about just transition in an ASEAN or developing country context, it can be very different from how we think about just transition within developed markets. In developed markets, just transition tends to be how do we take care of labor that's been displaced, right, as you move to new economic models or asset models. But within ASEAN, when we talk about just transition, it's this concept of balancing economic growth, lives and livelihoods, energy access, affordability and security with decarbonization. So let me throw a couple of metrics out there, and this will kind of ram home the point. If we take Indonesia, for example, the most populous ASEAN country within the region, the GDP per capita is, at this point, roughly about $5,000. Okay? By comparison, the GDP per capita of the UK is $45,000. So that's one huge difference. It's 1/10 of what the average UK GDP per capita is. The second thing is, if you look at the growth rate within ASEAN, it has the potential, and it has been delivering to roughly 5% of annual growth in GDP per year. So it has space to grow, it can grow, it wants to grow, right? Another metric is roughly 50% of the ASEAN population is going to join the middle class, between 2020 to 2030. So as the middle class continues to expand, they're going to want more of the good things that all of us already have. More iPhones, more consumption, more electricity, etc., etc. And this is demonstrated by an energy forecast of 2020 to 2030 of a 42% increase in energy demand, right? So if you just kind of contextualize ASEAN from that growth perspective, there are a lot of people who have the potential and the desire to continue to grow economically. But that's going to come at a huge footprint if we can't find the cleanest, most low-carbon way in order to support that development. Because between the two, I can guarantee you, they will go for that growth. The question is, will we deliver decarbonization as they go for that growth? It's not the other way around. It is not, we will decarbonize at all costs and destroy the economic models of ASEAN. So really, that tricky conversation on just transition is one, that within the region, governments, regulators, financiers like us, were trying to cram all of our heads and thinking hats on to figure out how to deliver that. Yeah.
Madalena, how about for Malaysia?
Right. Well, I just want to echo what has actually been said by Suisa and Eric, because those are actually the key challenges. But what I also want to do is to just throw some numbers. In terms of greening ASEAN by 2030, if we are to do that, the amount of investments that would actually be needed is in the tune of between 2 to 3 trillion US dollar. That's a huge sum. And if we look at the energy sector alone, if we are to actually transition the energy sector based on the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario estimates, what ASEAN requires is, somewhere in terms of, in the volume of 180 billion US dollar annually, right? Now, and that's just, for us to maintain, to be able to achieve the climate targets. And for us in Malaysia, we are a small country, but not as small as Singapore in terms of size, not GDP. The IEA estimates that Malaysia requires at least about 375 billion US dollar for us to meet our net zero. So I'm just throwing some numbers, but whatever it is, these are huge numbers, right? And Eric mentioned about the need for ASEAN to actually balance in terms of its development priorities along with the need to transition now, and that is actually very true, because what has happened post-COVID is that, the governments have actually very limited fiscal space. And what that means is that, the need to carefully balance between how much you are going to allocate, for development priorities and how much you are going to allocate for transition purposes becomes a lot more challenging. So costly, resource intensive and technology intensive, that is actually one of the critical challenge that we face. And if we are to drastically shift some of the allocation towards transition, it could actually be at the expense of allocation for health, for education. So that is going to actually have a lot of ramifications going forward. Now, we also have heard, and we also know that, globally there's been a lot of international pledge to mobilize some assistance towards climate action. But we also know that, in reality, there is that big number, 100 billion US dollar annually that's been committed, but in reality, not much of it has actually been met. And a lot of it is actually, partly due to complexity in accessing those financial assistance, very rigorous approval process, which we can appreciate and understand why it needs to be in place, but I think there needs to be better contextualization of, where the developing economies, for instance, are. So just again, giving you some numbers, between 2000 and 2019, ASEAN countries, with the exception of Brunei and Singapore, we received a total of 56 billion US dollar. And looking at Malaysia, we have only received 141 million US dollar. So that's a very, very, very small amount. And the other major challenge, if I can be a little bit critical here, Darian, is in terms of the policies of the advanced economies. Some of these policies do have extraterritorial reach, we understand why the the discussion about the global South and North, right? So a lot of this is actually premised on the need for the global North to really transition, but at the same time, in the journey towards meeting that objective, there are actually negative implications and also challenges on the global South, and. So I think the challenge that we have is actually when the global North starts to adopt a one-size-fits-all policy regime, and we actually then have to do a lot more. We need to accelerate our transition, and at the same time we also have a lot of domestic priorities and issues which we need to navigate as well.
Yeah, very true. Now we're going to come on to discussing some of the legislation that has impacts along supply chains. We've heard that there's a lot of manufacturing, agriculture, a lot of supply chain, scope 3 emissions are actually happening and originating in ASEAN. Now we always hear that ESG data is one of the great enablers of sustainable finance, but that it's difficult to get. So perhaps we'll start with you, Jen. From Fidelity's perspective, international company, what challenges do you see in getting access to ESG data from perhaps ASEAN?
So I'm going to say something kind of maybe a bit non-intuitive. I think there's a lot of ESG data. Actually, I think there's too much. There's a ton of noise and not a lot of signal. And I think the challenge for investors is actually passing through that noise and finding the one or two bits that might actually represent signal in terms of materiality to the companies that you're trying to analyze. I think that said, I think the data environment is getting better, and I think we'll talk a little bit about all the different rules that are being put in place by different regulators across ASEAN to make more disclosure mandatory, and that will hopefully improve that noise to signal ratio. I still don't think it's the silver bullet, and I think a lot of rooms like this talk about ESG data as if it is going to be a silver bullet. I think possibly we are, as an industry, overselling sustainability disclosure and what it can really do. It can light parts of the market, it can highlight areas of emergent risk, but ultimately those risks have to be translated to financial risks. So you need policies, including some of the things that we're seeing in the EU come through that do have extraterritorial effect. Those will create the conditions for those risks to become financial risks, at which time the markets can then begin the process of pricing that in advance of that happening. But until that happens, simply relying on more disclosure to light everything, to me, I think is a bit of a rabbit hole.
Fair enough. And I'm happy to have controversial opinions, and we can always address them when we get to the questions. Maybe if I can ask the rest of the panel to talk about, in your countries, what is the regulatory and mandatory disclosure requirement area looking like, and where are you moving towards? So Swissa, what's happening in Thailand?
Yeah, so I think we are a bit contradictory, but we do think that ESG is important, because with the ESG data, we can use it to analyze the risks and also to know exactly what is happening on the ground. So like I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of SMEs in Thailand, and that is a challenge for us to really get the proper information, because most SMEs, don't survive longer than 5 years, and so it's not a priority for them to really invest in good data systems. So to address this, what we have been doing in Thailand is we have been engaging a lot with the stakeholders from the industry as well, from the other private sectors, and from the other government agencies, and we are discussing on how we can perhaps build on having a common data platform, for example. But these are still in discussion, so we haven't really finalized everything yet. There's a lot of details on, whether it is needed, how would it be designed to be most efficient. But for the disclosure, we also have, with our SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, and the Stock Exchange of Thailand, they have together revised the disclosure criteria, and in 2022, they now require listed firms to disclose sustainability information in its annual public filing. So this is, we call it the one report. And this is in according to ESG principles. So other than information on structure and other details of the company, there is a section on business sustainability development as well, and it covers the policies and also how it's actually impacted and assessed as well. So these are really important disclosures. And on the financial sector side, the Bank of Thailand, we issued earlier the directional paper this year. And we have mentioned in the paper that we would like to see the systemically important banks in Thailand disclose according to standards which are similar to the TCFD standards by 2025, and in later years by other financial institutions in Thailand. So we think for us, disclosure is important, and we already have some financial institutions who are in advance of our regulations, and they have already disclosed according to TCFD standards.
And I know from having worked in Thailand that companies listed on the Stock Exchange of Thailand, if you wanted to be included in the sustainability index of the SET, you had to be a member of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index from, I think, 2015. So there actually is quite a long history within the corporate sector of getting sustainability data, and Malaysia similarly has had quite proactive approach. Eric, what's happening in Singapore?
Yeah, so in Singapore, way back in maybe about 2015, 2016 latest, the Singapore Exchange came out and said all public listed companies had to do sustainability reporting on a comply or explain basis, which means you can't explain your way away, you just comply, right? So I think with listed companies, that's in pretty good shape. The big challenge now is with unlisted smaller companies that, again, on a daily basis are fighting inflation, labor issues, competitive market issues, and all of a sudden we want to throw a lot more sustainability reporting challenges on them. And I think the reality is this: it's not so much about sustainability reporting, it's about what matters for your sector and your industry, and what are the critical pieces of information your stakeholders really, really need. So I'll give you a classic example. For a big bank like UOB, of course, we have to report all sorts of metrics, right? But at the end of the day, when I look at my net zero commitments across the key sectors I have, and we have 6 sectors that we've covered, the numerator of every one of these net zero pathways is CO2, right? The denominator changes depending on the industry you're in. If you're in real estate, then it's your square footage. If it's automotive, it's kilometers driven. If it's power, it's megawatt hour generated, right? And so really, I think the way we've got to make ESG disclosure meaningful is less is more. And I kind of agree with Jen on this one. Less being very focused on what you really need an industry to deliver to, becomes more because that's exactly what your key stakeholders will measure you to, respond to, and work with you on, right? So I think with climate, for example, we tend to smash climate metrics together with this broad sustainability reporting ESG metrics. If we're trying to address climate, let's just talk about climate. Now, TNFDs coming, we heard about biodiversity just now. That's going to be a whole new kettle of complexity. If we thought one CO2 metric was difficult, think about all the various forms of nature. And I think with nature, absolutely, we've got to focus on which industries affect nature in what way and focus them in on the key metrics that we really want them reporting to. So I think we need to step away from this generic concept of sustainability reporting and go a lot more sectoral, a lot more industry, a lot more focused on which industries or sectors really need to be reporting to what and why and for who. Yeah.
Thank you. Madalena?
Right. Well, before I get into that, I just want to share that, in Malaysia, since 2019, we set up an industry regulator platform. We call it Joint Committee on Climate Change. So it's essentially a platform which started off as what we call a talk show. So it's just a forum where the industry exchange views, talk about their experiences and all that. But what has happened over the years is that it has actually evolved, and it is actually becoming a very important platform where the industry, financial sector industry, engages with the government side. And it is also a platform whereby the regulator and the industry actually co-create tools to help the industry, get up to speed in terms of their preparedness. So one of the areas that is being focused by the Joint Committee on Climate Change is on data. There's also another focus on governance and disclosures as well. So what the committee has done is it actually undertook a stocktake exercise to look at, what kind of data is needed and where those data is actually currently residing. Because again, you're talking about financial institutions having to, make decisions to understand, what kind of exposures do they have, and they also need data for them to actually be able to, structure instruments that would be suited to, the different sectors, the different types of clients. So they did that stock take exercise, and what they found is that about, only 49% of the data that is needed is available. And out of that 49%, only 18% is readily available. And for the remaining 51% is actually, not publicly available, or it's never been collected. So what they have done is actually to then translate this into a climate data catalog, and it is actually currently being used as reference by the industry. So the industry will then know, if I need, to look for this kind of data, where do I actually get it, and then how, and the efforts that they are doing now is really to look at how can we put all this data into a single open platform. So that is something that the government has recently announced. We are moving towards that direction, and that is actually a positive development for the industry. Now, over and above that, so we've heard about how the stock exchange has responded and how the regulators have responded. So it's similar in the case of Malaysia. So the stock exchange has had sustainability reporting for a while now, and what they have actually done recently is actually to further enhance it. So and it is actually being done in stages with TCFD compliant type of disclosure to be effective in 2025. For the banks and insurers, the mandatory reporting aligned with TCFD will be made mandatory next year. So currently the industry is in that preparatory stage, and one of the things which the Joint Committee on Climate Change has also done is actually to come up with what we call an application guide. So it's really to help the financial institutions to prepare themselves, for the 2024 mandatory requirement.
Now, you spoke about data platforms, and this is a question to everyone. I mean, we often see in developing markets that there can be technological leaps that actually, systems, you can see this with banks, it's gone from bricks and mortar to digital payments in some of the emerging markets. Are there any examples of emerging technologies that you see really enabling us to get access to better quality ESG data, or that are driving sustainable finance in a different way? So open to any panelist.
Maybe I'll give it a shot at this. Singapore built a very strong kind of fintech environment. So one of the big annual events Singapore is known for is the Singapore Fintech Festival. And there was a strong attempt to try to smash sustainability data with fintech capabilities together, right? We've been at this for the last couple of years. I don't think, in the grand scheme of things, it's been a roaring success. And one of the big learnings I think we're going back to is we need to think of essential sustainability data very much like how we think about financial reporting data, which is why I think ISSB is, scaring a lot of people with its implementation, but absolutely required. As a bank, if a client comes to me and says, hey, can you lend me $10 million? And I go, can I have your financial statements? Nobody's going to blink. They're going to give me their financial statements. But if someone comes to me and goes, hey, can I have $10 million? And I go, can I have your scope 1, 2, 3 and sustainability reporting data? They're going to look at me going, you're a bank. What, right? So I think we've got to change the nature of, again, essential sustainability data, such that by hook or by crook, whether we fancy scraping, fintech data or simple carbon calculators that convert economic and financial activity into scope 1, 2, and 3 type information, we just got to put the onus back on businesses that say, going forward, the information you need in order to do business is financial and your basic sustainability data. So I don't think there's going to be a magical wand that we wave and solves, for carbon or nature data that easily. That's my view.
Disappointing. We all want a magic wand. Madalena, sorry.
I just want to say that there are 2 initiatives which we are currently about to pilot. It's not there yet, but we are in final stages. So one is at the domestic level. This is where the stock exchange is collaborating with London Stock Exchange Group to develop what is called a centralized sustainability intelligence platform. So that is something, and I do see some of my financial institutions here, and they are actually going to be in part of the pilot. So the pilot is intended to enable businesses, to be able to measure and track at the very least their GHG emissions, and that will actually then facilitate, reporting and so forth. And the other one, which is being piloted at the ASEAN level, and this is actually being spearheaded by the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, is what we call the single access point ESG disclosures. So currently, I think there are 4 countries that will be, in the pilot. So the intention is really about, how do we make it easy for businesses, when they trade in other countries, how do they actually then make reporting, more easily in accordance with the different requirements and the different expectations of, their counterparties. So regional trade in ASEAN, has actually, grown a lot, and it will actually continue to grow further. So the question is, how do we then make it very easy for them? And the idea is that, there will be a set of information that will be given by the businesses, and it will be, collated at the platform level. And, depending on how you want to use it, is it for, to provide reporting as per TCFD, or is it to provide reporting as per UNPRI? So the idea is that the platform will then transform or translate the data, as per the needs of the counterparties. So that those 2 are actually being the expectation for the rollout is in the second half of this year.
Thank you. Jen?
I'm actually quite excited about technology improving ESG data. I think if we sort of just take a massive step back, there's really only 2 kinds of information. There's information from companies about their ESG practices, and there's information about companies. And I think information about companies that are based around geospatial information or physical information, I think that's where technology has a real opportunity to give us insight into the impacts of companies' business operations on the environment over and above what a company may be disclosing through these regulated and mandatory platforms. So I'll give you a sort of a live example. We've been actually partnering with a group of investors with a satellite company to look at images of where deforestation is happening in real time. And then we use that to inform our engagements with companies which have supply chains that extend into those areas. And generally speaking, it is new information for those companies, but it does take that engagement in a certain direction when you're able to sort of show photos and have that be presented in a way that cannot really be easily explained. That led us into another piece of work, which very fancily is called bioacoustics, but it's not. It doesn't sound. It's actually much more simple than it is. We partnered with a third-party provider, and again with some other investors, to send sound recording devices into forests. And actually, the first pilot was done in Borneo. And it was through our engagements with one of our investee companies that let us use their palm oil plantation as a test case. And we sent these recording devices, recorded, I think, about 4 terabytes worth of sound data in both the plantation in a conservation plot, so a plot that used to be plantation but had since been rehabilitated, and then a control plot, a virgin piece of forest. And we were able to measure and then extrapolate the sounds that were produced by the different forms of biodiversity in those areas, and then create a baseline for how those sounds vary across those different plots. And I won't sort of go into the details, but the initial findings confirmed kind of what we all intuitively know. There's very little biodiversity in a plantation, particularly palm oil. There's obviously significant more in a control plot. But I think what's exciting about this for me is that, and Eric talked about this, we're all grappling with this problem of how to measure nature loss, how to measure diversity loss. A lot of the ways that you currently do, there's lots of different ways, but a lot of them are quite invasive. They disturb the biodiversity that you're trying to measure, and they're quite expensive. This is potentially a low-cost way, which is scalable and non-invasive, that you could then try and replicate baselines in different parts of physical agricultural plots that you can then compare changes to over time. That could inform things like sustainable forestry management practices, or it could inform peer comparisons between different companies operating similar businesses in different parts of the world. I think I'm not saying this is a silver bullet, there's no silver bullet, but I think this is where I think technology has a real opportunity to give us a differentiated view of these sorts of impacts, which is kind of what we're all trying to ultimately grapple with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I mean, even in the oceans, coral reefs, people are starting to measure the sounds of the coral reef as an indicator of biodiversity. So I think this kind of use of technology for comparing almost the incomparable, it does start to develop more of a sophisticated suite of tools that we can have. Swissa, any examples from Thailand?
Yeah, so, definitely I agree with you with the geospatial data. That's very exciting. And in Thailand, we have mentioned the big agricultural sector. So we are seeing a lot of the big agricultural firms, apply this technology in actually doing smart agriculture. So they'll be using geospatial data to map the crops, and also using sensors to measure, the nutrients in the soil as well, and to see how much water is needed. So to use more, to use this more efficiently, and also to get the best crop out. So we are really seeing technology, being used in a number of ways, and all this technology is not only having better yield for the crops as well, but it's also gathering information on the changes in the environment, in the temperature. And we are seeing this, with agri-fintechs, that are emerging in Thailand. And we have some of them, they're working together with farmers. So they have an application, and these farmers can access this real-time data, from the satellites, from a number of resources, and then they can use it to plan their crop formation. And once they have that information, they get the yields, they input more data into the app. And then this is also linked to the financial institutions. So the financial institutions then have more information about, the farms. and the small, especially the small farms, on the crops. And so this is something that is, a win-win solution for both, and so the farmers are getting more financing as well. The financial institutions are having more information, and this is something that we think is really, going the way forward. Another way that we are seeing technology being used in Thailand is we are also having some technology firms trying to, gather information from all these different sources. So, for example, we have data from from all the disclosures. We have data from certificates. We are seeing some companies actually use all this blockchain technology to consolidate all this fragmented information in one place, and also to help the companies with their disclosures or with their reports. So I think technology is really exciting, and we can use it to not only gather information, we can use it to reduce the fragmentation problem, and we can also use it to reduce the problem of verification that we often see in data.
Yeah, some great examples. I might pivot back to a point, Madalena, that you started to raise before, which is the impact of some of the regulations, particularly coming out of the European Union, which will impact the companies in ASEAN. Jen, you mentioned about deforestation, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. When I went to Thailand recently, that is what everybody's talking about. Maybe starting with you, Madalena, what are the impacts that you're seeing from some of this legislation that's coming out of European Union in particular on ASEAN, and what do you think we can start to do to have more of a dialogue? Because at the moment it does feel very one-directional from Europe to ASEAN or the rest of the world.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. So, policies such as, or regulations such as CBAM, does have major implications, on other countries, and in particular, countries where the infrastructure may not actually be ready, where the policies, are still yet to mature. So we are already seeing the implications of that. One thing that is positive coming out from there is the fact that, businesses have actually then started not only to be aware of it, but to, start, doing something about it. They are starting to gather information to understand, their own emissions profile, for instance, and for them to also then, start, looking at what they need to do. Now, in the case of Malaysia, when we look at it, about 57% of our exports to the EU is likely going to be affected, and these are, sectors that involve raw materials, which are, in the hard-to-abate sectors. So a lot of it is actually in that sector, and of course, there's a bit of consumer appliances as well. So now, what we have actually done, because the impact is actually significant to the business sector, and what we have actually done is to focus more on the SMEs, because these are the ones that are most affected, and we all know that the SMEs are also the one that is not that will have financial constraints, that have, a challenge. There are challenges in terms of expertise and resources. So what the central bank has done is that we develop what we call a greening the value chain scheme, and under this scheme, the central bank provides 0% funding to the financial institution. And the financial institution will then provide a matching amount and lend it to the SME at a concessional rate. Now, it's not just that. So what we did was actually to blend it, or to overlay with technical capacity building. So, and also in terms of access to tools. So what will happen is that, so if I am an SME and I have exports to the EU, and I go under this particular scheme, I get financing. I also get access to capacity building, technical training, and I also have access whereby someone will actually come to my premise and look at the operations, look at my businesses, look at what plants or equipment I'm using, and will provide advice to me as to how I should be changing, some of the machines, or, making adjustments and so forth. And at the same time, the SME will also be able to access tools for them to then start measuring their emissions, which will then facilitate, in terms of their reporting later on. So that's something that we just started early this year. We work with what we call an anchor corporate, and the idea is that the anchor corporate will lead to green its value chain, and at the same time will then also help the those in their value chain that will be having trade activities with the EU side.
Yeah, that's a great proactive example of how to use those regulations to hopefully have a greater impact in your country. Eric, what are you seeing in Singapore?
Yeah, if I build on Madalena's point, I think that's the right thinking, right? It's shifting away from this general concept of net zero to sectoral value chains and how to be able to bring the entire value chain along. So what we see in Singapore is a shift over to that style of thinking. So I'll give you an example of what we're doing within the banking sector with our bank. Is we built a tool called the Sustainability Compass that can be customized by industry, right? It's a simple online 14 question tool that a small business can log in, answer all the questions, and it gives you a sense of where you are in your maturation journey, right, or sustainability. Also gives you a sense of where you need to be working on. And so what we're trying to do with this tool is really kind of bridge that zero to foundational level understanding and action, right? And the reason that's important is because if we're not asking you and you're not asking yourself, at some point a buyer within your value chain is going to ask you exactly the same question, right? So we're trying to accelerate them on that process. What we have found is our SME customers respond to two major stakeholders. One, the supply chain and value chain, right? Simply because they need to continue to be able to sell into the value chain. The second is regulatory or policy clarity. So that's one of the things we're trying to help all of our ecosystems kind of understand is how do we work with anchor clients, very similar to what Madalena was talking about, across be it real estate, be it agriculture, right, be it automotive, working with big anchor clients and greening their value chain, right, through advisory as well as financing, but at the same time working with our governments and our regulators to say, hey, you may not have been aware, but within your hands, you hold a policy lever that can bring great clarity into this particular sector in terms of what they're looking for. And the more we can achieve policy clarity or regulatory clarity, with the more confidence the real economy will be able to invest. Because think about it, when a company invests, they're looking at committing capex for the next 5, 10, 15 years, and the last thing they want is changes in regulations 2 to 3 years down the road, right? So the more clarity we can give them, the more they're willing to invest, and the more bankable it will be from an FI perspective as well.
Swissa, what are you seeing in Thailand?
Yes, so I'm glad you mentioned about policy clarity, because that's something that in Bank of Thailand and the financial sector we have been trying to promote. So, in order to do that, we have, since 2019 set up a working group with all the financial regulators in Thailand. So it's with Bank of Thailand, the Ministry of Finance, Securities Exchange Commission, Office of Insurance Commission, and the Stock Exchange of Thailand. So together, we discuss, how can we provide, a common signal to the financial industry about what we want to see going forward. And in this working group, we decided that we needed to have a clear policy direction. So we published the Sustainable Finance Initiatives. And, this was a working paper that showed us, there are 5 key areas that we would like to focus on for Thailand going forward. And there's 5 key building blocks for namely having a taxonomy framework for Thailand, looking at incentives, having the proper financial products and services, looking at data issues and disclosure and capacity building. So these are things that we thought, were important for the financial industry going forward in Thailand. And in continuation of that, after we had separate smaller working groups, looking deep dive into each of the 5 key building blocks, we issued a directional paper, which was published last year as a guideline for the financial sector to take into account the business sector needs. And so one of the first key building blocks, was actually just published earlier this month, is our taxonomy framework. And this was done together with the private sector as well. So we have a Thailand Taxonomy Board. And on the board, we had the Ministry of Environment as well. We had the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Transport, and other private sectors such as the Federation of Thai Industries, Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Thai Bankers Association and the Association of International Banks. So we tried to bring, the collaboration, like you said, both the public and private sector together to work on, how can we make it be clearer for direction we want to go forward. And our taxonomy, focuses on the 2 main sectors that are the most polluting sectors in Thailand. So it's a phase 1, so we have it for the energy sector and for the transportation sector. And so this is a taxonomy that is both a threshold and traffic light system. So it's not just about, what's green and not green, but it also gives the thresholds, that we want to see going forward. How do we want to see the energy sector transitioning in the future? And and this will be something that they can use for not only for disclosures, but also for risk assessments as well. So this is something that we have been doing in Thailand as well, in order to work collaboratively and give a strong signal. We hope that the signal is clear to the financial sector, and we have other key building blocks going on as well. Capacity building is something that's ongoing all the time, I think, with the financial sector, and incentives as well is something that we are also looking into as well.
Thank you. I mean, we won't get into the taxonomy in depth, but Thailand has a taxonomy. Eric, Singapore has a taxonomy. Does Malaysia have a taxonomy?
Yes.
We have an ASEAN taxonomy.
Yes.
Everyone refers back to the EU taxonomy. So that development of a common language, we seem to have split down into multiple different languages. I mean, Jen, you kind of span across Europe to ASEAN. What are you seeing from this regulatory approach?
Well, I think actually beyond deforestation and CBAM, the regulation that could have the most impact is the Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD. It's not a done deal, but that could have very significant implications for ASEAN supply chains, human rights, labor rights, and so on. And that's something to watch out for. But I think the responses of my fellow panelists, I think, highlight one really amazing thing about ASEAN, which is its remarkable adaptability and flexibility. These are initially requirements that carry costs, but ultimately turn into great opportunities if you are able to adapt the way you do business in the right way. And if these requirements become more global, or even if they don't become more global, even if they apply really just to a very large market like the European Union, and ASEAN is a net winner in terms of its ability to export into Europe, meeting these heightened standards when other parts of the world are not yet as able. I think that's a terrific win. That's a win for all of us who care about sustainability, and it's a win for industries, factories in the ASEAN region.
Unexpectedly positive there, Jen. That's great to hear.
I'm generally positive, my views on data notwithstanding.
Okay, now I want to leave time for questions, so start thinking about your questions, everyone in your audience. I'm going to end with one final question for the panel from me. So we're here at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Summit. What do you think the most powerful thing that sustainable finance can deliver in our region? Jen, I'll start with you.
Gosh, I think sustainable growth. I think the just transition that Eric referred to. To me, just transition is still a very frustratingly abstract concept to most people. Everyone understands intuitively. It's something around climate decarbonization plus some social elements, but what does that look like? We've done a piece of work actually with the Impact Investing Institute in the UK to try to put more definition around what this means at a corporate level, because that's kind of how, as investors, we want to be translating these impacts. You've got environmental action clearly as the first condition. You've got improvement of socio-economic distribution, and you've got improving the community voice. And actually, if you think about how can you implement these in regions like India or Indonesia, which are very heavily thermal coal dependent, how can you think about these concepts and reframe the challenge of that energy transition in that region? I think there's a lot that sustainability, a lot that this movement can bring to the way in which ASEAN can develop.
Switzer?
Yeah, so I think, for us, you mentioned just transition, and in Thailand it's something that we actually incorporate into the way we actually think about sustainability. So, for example, in deciding our key building blocks, we also look at the timing and the speed of the transition. We try to make sure that there's a balance so that, it's not too fast and it's not too slow either. And in that way, I think, sustainable finance in ASEAN especially, or in countries like in Thailand, where we have a big, we have different populations, we have different size companies, we have smaller SMEs down the supply chain. The answer is really, can we get financing to all different levels of the companies? Can we really help this, ASEAN really be able to go into the future and grow sustainably in a way that is, doesn't affect us too much?
This is going to sound strange because I'm a bank, right? Sustainable finance, I'm worried is going to start getting into trouble. And the reason I say this is everybody's big on sustainable finance now. We're not answering a more fundamental question, which is, what are we sustainably financing towards? Is there a transition plan at a national level? Is there a transition plan at a national bisectoral level? Is there a transition plan at a company entity level? Is there a transition plan by each of the FIs within those domestic economies? And I think if we don't get the transition planning conversation all stitched up from national level commitments to sectors, to real economy players, to financial institution players, we're going to run off with this beautiful narrative of sustainable finance, blended finance, climate finance, throw another million terms at it. And 10 years from now, we're going to look back, horror of horrors, we've done so much sustainable finance, but somehow we still haven't bent the curve in a way that we wanted to. So I think that we're getting very close to a point where we've got to shift the narrative on sustainable finance to transition planning and tying transition and sustainable finance to those transition plans, right? So that's me being quite controversial about transition planning. We need it. We really need it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I
Madalena?
don't that we actually do need it. Well, I think Asia as, as a region, we are actually projected to be the fourth largest economy, by 2030. And, I do believe, so I'm actually a very positive and optimistic person. So I do believe that sustainable finance can actually, be a very potent tool for us to, get there. But what I want to say is actually something different from what has actually been said. And this is actually based on the experience that, we have had, I have had, working, in the ASEAN, on ASEAN matters. Now, what I find is that sustainable finance has actually brought the region even closer. And I give you an example of this, because ASEAN is actually, as you said, it's very diverse. We have different types, we have countries, at different levels of economic development, different maturity, and so forth. But at the same time, when we actually pull our resources together, when we actually have, that very clear line of sight of where we want to be, things get done. An example of that is actually the ASEAN taxonomy. I'm not too sure how many of you are actually familiar with the ASEAN taxonomy. It's actually a multi-tiered taxonomy. So it actually has two components. One is what we call the foundation framework, which is actually principle-based. And we have another component which is called the plus standard, and that is actually, the advanced framework. And that's where, you have the science-based thresholds and so forth. Never in ASEAN's history have we actually been able to do something within a very, very short period of time. And we, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, which is entrusted to develop the ASEAN Taxonomy, was formed in March 2021. By November 2021, within a span of 7 or 8 months, we actually came out with the conceptual framework of the ASEAN taxonomy. And within 7 to 8 months, we developed the full foundation framework that is which we launched in March this year, which is ready to be used. And we've also developed the technical screening criteria for one sector, which is the energy sector. So never in my entire, life as, a central banker have we actually done that, at the ASEAN level. So to me, it really brings us together, and it really enables us, to really devote our resources, on what would be most critical for the region.
I think that's a great point to land on. It's common across many of the languages in Asia. Rather than yes, the answer is can. And I think there is a real can-do attitude. So I'll turn it to the audience now. I think we have roving mics. If you raise your hand was raised earlier. If you could say your name and the organization that you represent, and then please direct your question to the panel.
Well, thanks, Madam Chair, to allowing me to use my role as also a mic holder, but I can't help myself to ask a question because it's an incredibly well resourced, very incredibly well developed also panel. So one thing that I'm wondering, if we look at the transition plans that you mentioned, what scenarios can you think of if we took the 4 current agenda items? Are there any scenarios that you can think of in the next 10 years that decouple, let's say, by a third revenue from emissions, and another one that says half, or another one that says actually it can be done 66% and 100%. So can you reflect a little more on scenarios, how you see the decoupling of emissions growth and revenue growth or GDP growth? Thanks. And then I pass on the mic.
Anyone want to take this particular question? I think we're getting back to the question of maybe developed and developing, and how that is different in ASEAN to perhaps, developed markets in Europe and the UK. Eric, you're looking like you've got at least another question back, if not an answer.
Could you reframe the question? I was kind of following half of it. Could you just re-ask the question again?
Yes. So if we look at those 4 agenda items, there might be favoring green growth.
The panel mightn't have seen, so we've got up there, the current agenda for ASEAN includes driving economic growth and integration, infrastructure development, safeguarding biodiversity, and regional trade. Right. So these are some of the aims of ASEAN.
If we think of them as parts of scenarios, if we build in 10 years how the future would look like in ASEAN, how do they favor the decoupling of emissions and GDP growth, economic growth? And are there any scenarios that you can think of where, then there is an 80% scenario where the emissions are decoupled, there is a 20% scenario. And what would that look like? What would that future look like for you?
I'll take a crack at it.
Take a crack at it. That's all we ask.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. I think if I were to try to answer the first 2, right? Because biodiversity, I think, is still very, very early stage, very nascent. And when we talk about decarbonization, it is still not entirely clear, right? The size of impact of the actions, right? But when you look at Southeast Asia, and again, you know, we're lumping the region together, it's got to go country by country. The big conversation is around the clean energy transition, right? So when we looked at our net zero targets by sectors, one thing became very clear to us. If we can crack the clean energy transition, you pretty much crack the big elephant in the room for almost every other sector. But if you can't crack the clean energy transition, then all the efforts of all the other sectors, be it built environment, construction, automotive, etc., you're gonna stall. So I think when we think about 66% scenarios, 80% scenarios, whatever it may be, the ability to wind down fossil fuels and wind up renewables or low carbon energy sources, be it solar, geothermal, wind, hydro, possibly even nuclear, touch wood, right? In a way that is able to continue to drive economic growth or support the economic growth, right? I think it's critically important. I was chatting with a professor from one of the American universities, and he shared this study that had not been published, but I'll just share with you the consequence of it, right? They actually modeled out one of the biggest countries in ASEAN, I won't name which one, to say if by 2050, this particular massive country were able to shift completely to renewables, what would it do to GDP? And what it showed was by 2050, GDP would actually be better if they went completely renewable, which is wonderful, right? But, and here's the but, between 2022 to 2050, if that transition on moving over to renewables was mismanaged, the amount of damage it would cause to the GDP during those interim years could be as large as 25% of the economy. And that's that big conversation that every politician understands and is trying to manage. So, you know, in that big joke, right? Politicians don't understand environment. Actually, they absolutely do. It's the environmentalists who don't understand politics, right? And politics is about staying in power, getting re-voted in so we can keep doing that good work. And I think that big 800-pound gorilla in the room is the clean energy transition. Kind of there, but not there in terms of our response.
Thank you, Eric. Jen, did you have a quick
if I
comment?
Could just make a super quick comment. I think the whole idea around decoupling GDP and carbon emissions, I think that's still quite new. I think we've had a few examples of where that's happened, and maybe that points the way to the future. That'd be great. Actually, I think if you look at the individual examples, I think they've been largely achieved by the offshoring of emissions to Asia, particularly the ASEAN region. If you adjust all of those figures for consumption rather than for of production, I think all of a sudden you'll find that, shock horror, consuming stuff actually costs more carbon emissions to make. So I don't know if, I think to your specific point around whether ASEAN can achieve that, absolutely, if ASEAN itself offshores manufacturing to somewhere else. But again, you're just transferring the problem to another part of the world. ASEAN can then enjoy a services-based economy where people consume higher levels but don't have to emit more carbon, because making stuff has a carbon cost to it.
Very good.
Yep. Okay, sorry. Thank you for the really interesting discussion. I'm Elizabeth from Client of International Environmental Law NGO, Energy Systems Lawyer. I have two questions. The first question is about the role that you see, or maybe not, of litigation risk in ASEAN, particularly also with respect to, I think, the comment regarding the lack of clarity regarding sectoral transition pathways, because the kind of duties that directors have of companies, or the kind of fiduciary duties that investors have, may be linked also to the lack of clarity. And like, how would you necessarily consider that, especially with the way that law may assist in moving the needle on the transition? The second question I have is, can you identify specific things that you think Europe can learn from ASEAN with respect to net zero transition? Thank you.
Good question. Who wants to take maybe the first question? Madalena, I can see you're busily writing. You look most prepared.
Just writing the question, actually. No, but I think I do see, litigation having a role, but then again, if one understands ASEAN or even Asia for that matter, it is actually not a litigious, culture. The litigious culture is not there, but more and more we do see that having legal frameworks will help provide clarity. So we talk a lot about policy clarity, and if that is actually being supported by very clear laws and enforcement, so it would actually provide a very good impetus for the countries in ASEAN to actually move forward.
Maybe on the second question, what can European Union perhaps learn from ASEAN?
Maybe I'll take a crack at that. I think that's a very Western world question. and the reason I say that is I think, the developed nations have always been quite keen to teach the developing nations what to do. Right? I think if I were to reframe the question, it's important to meet every economy where they are and figure out the best path forward for those individual economies. So one of the things I will share with you is, even though this is the panel on ASEAN, right, and we kind of have a collective ASEAN identity, each of us in a country identity are extremely individual, right? The way decisions are made in Malaysia versus Thailand versus Singapore versus Indonesia are all completely different, right? So I think if the EU wanted to engage with ASEAN or any other, geographical jurisdiction, I think it's very important to go in and figure out what the decision-making frameworks, dynamics, priorities of that particular jurisdiction is, and then figure out how to meet them there and bring them forward. I think that's probably how I would answer that question.
Yeah, we haven't really touched on culture, but it does play a very important role in each of the countries. Swissa?
Yeah, I wanted to add to Eric, so definitely, in ASEAN, every country, we're all very unique, very different. And the context of each country is also very different. So, for example, we talk a lot here about emissions, reducing, emissions. But Thailand, actually, we less than 1% of global emissions, So the priority for us may be quite different. So I think we have to look at the context. For example, in Thailand, we have more of a social aspects. We're worried about the small SMEs. We're worried about the agricultural households. How can we, look at each country and see how the transition going forward? So I think, going forward, I think we need to really look at each country more individually and maybe have more catered or more defined plans for each country.
Another question? Ooh, multiple questions. Gosh, yeah. The lady in the front here.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, we've got a man with a mic, and then we'll go to you.
So Ulf Allansson, I'm from the Anthropocene Fixed Income Institute. We do research in fixed income markets on transition finance and green versus gray finance. One question here, and you've mentioned it several times around the diversity of nations here, and a number of these countries are obviously climate vulnerable. And then we have Indonesia, which is the net benefactor of a very big thermal coal trade. It's one of the biggest producers and exporters in the world. How does the discussion go within the group of the ASEAN countries between the sort of vulnerable versus the profiteering countries? The second question is, I think that the Indonesian coal trade is going to be some sort of litmus test for, if transition finance is going to work out. If I am a European or US investor, I want to engage, I want to be part of that journey. What would be your sort of recommendations in terms of engaging on the Indonesia thermal coal trade? Thank you.
Anyone want to take this?
Okay. Well, I just want to say this, that, in ASEAN, we do have different platforms, where either the ministers, the leaders, or even the regulators and central banks, get together. And there are areas where we will agree to disagree. There are areas where, we agree that, if, because we are part of this region, there's a need for us to work together, and the ASEAN taxonomy is actually a case in point. And one thing, you know, and when you look at the makeup of ASEAN, not all ASEAN members are actually the largest producers, you know, of coal, for instance. So when looking at the ASEAN taxonomy, we do note that, you know, ASEAN as a region will need to transition, and you know, and because of that, you know, we recognize that there's a need for us, you know, to have a framework that will enable and facilitate, you know, ASEAN to actually transition. And that's why when you look at the ASEAN taxonomy, and I think it's the only taxonomy in the world that actually recognizes coal, transition away from coal to be green. Nowhere else in the world you would actually see that. Of course, GFANS later on came out with, you know, their own principles as well. But what it shows is that, you know, there are areas where, you know, we can agree to disagree, where there are areas where, you know, we know that it is actually very critical for us as a region, and therefore, you know, we need to actually then, you know, have that alignment. Not sure whether I answer your question, but yeah.
I'll pile in a little bit on coal. Coal is extremely tricky and it's extremely emotional. And if you think about this conversation of be it thermal coal mining or coal-fired power plants, I would say that there are two types of conversations that if you could successfully have, you could successfully participate in supporting from a transition finance perspective. The first is around a conversation with a coal entity around their transition plans. This is something we've been trying very, very hard with our clients to have conversations on. And I will tell you, it is probably the single most difficult conversation for thermal coal mine to have, right? And so we, at this point, have not yet seen, but again, it's first half of 2023, right? A coal player come up with what we consider super high quality decarbonization plan that aligns with their national NDCs or commitments, right? If we see that, we will finance their transition all day long, right? And at this point, we haven't seen it yet, but perhaps if all of us collectively continue to push on that, you know, the urgency will go up. So that's around general coal. Around CFPPs, there's been a conversation around financing managed phase-out of coal-fired power plants. I think it's a great idea. Just to give you guys the statistics, the CFPPs in ASEAN are young, right? They're 12 to 15 years old compared to a lot of the developed world CFPPs at, you know, 35 to 40 years old. So there's a lot of useful life that's still left that such financing structures or MPOs, managed phase-out, structures are trying to finance to help accelerate the phase out of. It's early stages. I think it does come with a lot of considerations that need to be addressed, particularly around carbon leakage, making sure that those entities and countries continue to hold their commitments of decarbonization, making sure that the dollars are going to where the most impact can be had rather than just buying people out of assets that weren't going to be that useful anyway. But certainly around MPO type structures, if you keep your eye on that, that might be an area to participate that's meaningful.
Okay, I'm feeling the pressure of being in an examination room with a big kick-ass clock at the back and the hand is about to go straight upwards. So one last quick question, because we already gave you the microphone. Final question.
Thanks for allowing that. I'm Julia Bingler. I'm working at the University of Oxford and at the Council on Economic Policies in Zurich. I have the impression, so we were talking about ASEAN and about the European Union, but what about the US? So is there a reason why we haven't talked about that today? And what would be your impression like of the role of the US for both ASEAN and of ASEAN for the US?
Wow, I don't know how to go there. Like, look, I think there's a broader geopolitical issue around U.S. and China, and where does ASEAN sit between those two poles. I think historically what ASEAN has done, which is very ASEAN, is that it's benefited from both sides. And it's currently a net beneficiary of manufacturing moving out of China into Vietnam and Thailand and other places. But also, I think the economic links and the military links of the ASEAN region into the US are probably less well known. China gets the headlines because it regards ASEAN as the back door geographically, but if you look at the involvement of the US, it's spread out across multiple decades, across, embedded deep into private supply chains, and so on and so forth. I think there is not the time to get into an exploration around the geopolitics of how ASEAN positions itself. And I think if ASEAN does it well, it could also be a beneficiary of a lot of that broader tension by being able to a certain extent, offer different things to different sides.
Okay, I'm going to say saved by the clock. We don't need to go into that conversation, but please do feel free to approach the panelists with a more in-depth discussion. Thank you very much for coming to this session, and please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.